Yo, it's me, Nails, bitch. Um, I got another great book review video for you here. Quick little review. So basically, Roadwork by Stephen King. My copy was old and it just, well, I got angry and I ripped it in half, obviously. So not really, but this is a 1981 thriller novel for about 220 pages. It's very tragic and it's a solid recommend. I give it a 7 out of 10, which is a pretty good rating for me. So anyway, you've got this guy, Barton. Spoiler-free intro. Will warn of spoilers as I progress in the review. So Barton is basically approaching middle age, has a tragic life, is hardworking, and always been practical, competent, smart, and sometimes bullshits people to get what he wants and gets involved in some mild scummy deal making with other people, which is one of the reasons why he can't exactly resist the competitive bureaucratic greed based encroaching phenomenon of corporations and bureaucracies and the city government in his town trying to get a certain amount of money from building a certain number of roads, even if it means forcing people off of their property and replacing his industrial laundromat. So what he does is basically he starts to realize the limits of his influence because he has more morals than them in certain ways. He's more of an emotional guy, more practical, and less obsessed with greed and getting clout because he's very independent. And so basically, he has this emotional attachment to his job, his workplace, his family, his neighborhood, and his house, which is pretty relatable and understandable. A huge amount of sentimental attachment. And so basically, having been like unwilling and full of pride to like find other ways to make money and getting lost in his passion for his work, which is all he really knows because he's somewhat simple minded at that. He doesn't really work hard to continue to like provide for his family after the major depression happens from the cruelty of the universe throwing a wrench into his life by allowing his son to develop cancer, and then next thing you know he's basically not making healthy decisions, and he's like we're getting it towards the middle of his progression towards basically like a suicidal mindset towards life of not protect like caring for himself and working hard. He's starting to shut down and he's starting to give up on life because he's just crushed by anger, frustration, and despair. But that's not what he tells himself on a day-to-day basis. Instead, he drowns things out with procrastinating what he doesn't know how to handle, having already given life his all and still feeling just totally abandoned by society because of the nature of like business, which business is even worse now considering 43 years later since this book came out. Just this soulless government, I mean not government, but sometimes involved with government because the government's various government levels act like businesses sometimes, but like so many businesses come together to create this universal negative reinforcement cycle of bad business ethics, which makes Barton's encroaching insanity, which is like multiple personality disorder, which is evolving out of being just psychologically and spiritually decimated by the reality of his world and his unique spirit not fitting into that world. And so the multiple personality disorder is what gradually drives him towards violent revenge based actions. And so there's a degree of sympathy for the character, but the character is far less heroic than I've seen in characters in other of King's works. But that is both a good and bad quality of this book because it makes it more realistic. Another example for it being realistic, there's nothing supernatural in this book, like other of King's works, and it also feels made just layers and layers of realism, like realistic blue collar type dialogue, especially with certain asides when characters are giving stories. Like there's an example where a certain gangster talks about a rabid dog, not a rabid dog, but a violent dog that I think mauled a kid. That's just drives it into your mind of how good King is at immersing you in layers of storytelling. And another scene where another character is talking about prostitution, and so there's this very like specifically 1970s like dry sort of aspect, like this grimy underworld sort of darkness feel to this book that really comes out of the genuine place of just despair and is universally relatable to anyone in the working class, anyone who's ever been poor at any point in their life, or just worked really hard on something and felt betrayed thereafter, especially if it's just kind of the perfect storm of negative conditions with the right personality in a situation that's really easy to envision happening, where basically this guy is going crazy and doesn't have a plan, but he like a force of will, he's worked so hard in his life that that work needs to go somewhere. And I think the the story really comes from a place of my analysis, my psychological analysis, considering everything I know and have read about King, is that it's basically I took notes. I had to take notes for this one. That it's basically like the fear of not being able to provide for one's family, especially one's children. In this case, Barton's son, can push people over the edge, and that seems a huge motivator. And so having loyalty to that and not loyalty to your own ego, while other men engaged in business practices in the world are willing to screw each other out of, resources and stuff, it can, and then that one thing you're working towards is taken away from you by cancer. It's basically like all bets are off, and then you see the monstrous potential of apathy and how some people are driven to extreme crime. And so that it's one of the most heaviest, most realistic slow burns of a similar story of like the guy who's lost everything and then goes apeshit crazy on people, like Joker, Taxi Driver, the original Mad Max, the first film, Breaking Bad. Several of those things had to have been inspired, especially Breaking Bad, by this story, because there are just too many similarities. You got this, white, everyday middle class guy, working his ass off, being a decent person, being a friend, who's never been violent in his life, who's smart, competent, but his marriage is sort of on the rocks, a little iffy. His son is a debilitating disease. In this case, it was cancer, and his son is gone. And the similarities keep stacking up, like going into the crime underworld in his local town, doing things he's never done before, and then literally the book at a certain point describes that he realizes he's exhilarated by getting gradually involved in these things. Meanwhile, his marriage is failing. He's trying to secure money in different ways, and like there's similarity after similarity to Breaking Bad. That my personal theory is that this book was had to have been a huge part of I'm not 100% sure about this, but it was most likely a huge inspiration for the writers of that show. And I'm not complaining. I mean, that does, in some ways, I think Breaking Bad does owe a debt to this book, because no one's going to convince me, having read it, that it wasn't inspired. I could go on and list more similarities. There's way more, I just don't have time. So basically, moving on. So the main character, Barton, is basically a tragic character that one might be, as I was originally tempted to think, oh, this is going to vent my own anger out of the sort of unfair, oppressive nature of bureaucracies that I deal with in my day-to-day life, especially in the workforce and such. And we all see in politics and the division that it arouses in people, and it'll be a way to like vent anger out. And it's absolutely not what I thought. It's more of a personal story that's actually sad and doesn't really glamorize any of what happens. It's much more responsible, mature, true to form, like honest, realistic than what I expected from a Stephen King story. And like I've said about the other Bachman books, painful to read, very similar to The Long Walk. There's this feeling of like gradually rising depression and loss of energy to want to see how things turn out, because you're seeing this guy go downhill in a way that's, for me, even more tragic and dark than Breaking Bad in a certain way, because he really does feel like a victim of mental illness, and that's one unique element that sets it apart from Breaking Bad. So anyway, so the depressing nature of the novel is what makes it memorable, effective, and real, and I give it that aspect of it a 10 out of 10. But I personally don't like to feel that way when I read most fiction. I typically would like, if I'm going to read about the theme of heroism in a fiction that I want to escape to relatively to a degree so that I can visualize aspects that I can apply in my real life. I can see that done 1,000 different ways, and never get tired of it. I read a story like this, and there's moments where it seems to drag a little because it's so depressing that I'm actually finding myself wondering, like, what does this say about me that I'm reading a book like this? Because this is more of what I already have enough of this negativity in my real life. You know, some people out there, this might be a huge mind blower and a huge trip. For me, I've had enough, you know, darkness in my past and present that I have to deal with, that it wasn't quite as good as other Stephen King books I've read. And that's more of a personal note, but it does take points off of my 10 out of 10 level 10 scale. So anyway, there, as with many Stephen King books, there's many like subtle lines of like funny, like deadpan quality, which in a sort of nihilistic, self-removed way really adds to the overall thing. Um, that is like, so I mean, it's not always totally depressing if you're able to not get too attached. Maybe I'm just too sympathetic, like too emotional, but you feel bad for this guy the more you know about him, and the more you realize that he really doesn't have anywhere to go. His back's to a wall, and he's caught up in a society where it seems as though he's the collective consequence of victim of circumstance. And it's weird because I expected this revenge story to be a dark, villainous, like changeling type story, like a story of a guy coming into his, like, embracing his inner shadow and his bad side. That doesn't actually happen. It's more of a tragedy. It's more, and that's the weird part that's divisive, where I think that Barton's actions up until the very end are about 30% justified without spoiling, and about 70% not justified. And so now I will explain that, but to explain that I have to talk about spoilers. So if you care about spoilers, who cares about spoilers? Come on. Like, the intellectual discussion is more interesting, isn't it? So anyway, I'm going to start spoiling from now on. So you've been warned. Stop the video if you care about spoilers. So basically, what Barton does is he takes violent revenge on the mechanisms of the Roadwork without making it personal and actively trying to murder or harm anyone. But he's kind of can't believe he's doing it in a schizophrenic way that's brilliantly written, by the way, where it's like he's removed from what he's doing, almost like he's in a constant fugue state. And so, and by then he's already, you know, throughout the story let himself go. And by the way, I forgot to say something before. I said that this book was written in 1981, but it's really a book set in 1973 and 74, in the winter of 73, and it's basically a huge nostalgia trip. There's so many like references to things of the 70s, and I think it has a deliberately like 70s feel, where I'm imagining King, this is spiritually autobiographical for him, and just the darkness that he might have had to deal with when he was, you know, starting out as a new author. And just, it has just the complete everyman working class feel, which is, you know, it's kind of like a rite of passage in a way for men, I would say. So talk about effective story. Oh my gosh. And yes, there are moments of adrenalism that if you just like pure energy in stories for energy's sake, it does give you a rush. Definitely, that's like, you know, the red-blooded male side of me is like, I have to admire that. There's some pretty badass moments, especially the moments, the awesome scene of the arson moment, that sort of shit. where he trashes a construction crew vehicles in the middle of the night with a bunch of Molotov cocktails, and it has that slow burn variety where the realism overcompensates for the lack of energy that takes place in the moment to moment plot. And by that I mean the execution of it is just layered with the schizophrenic description of what's going through Barton's mind in a way that feels so utterly flawless that it's just Stephen King's writing ability. I basically worship it, and I talk about it too much. Sorry, it's a bad habit, but I've said that enough in other videos of mine. So anyway, so Barton's actions. Now this could be relative to modern political clashing ideologies that I want to talk about a little bit. I personally think that if Barton had higher ideals in his life, he would have been less tempted to put himself in negative states, which would allow the mental illness to drive out his bad side more and more, lose control, and ultimately do suicidal things, which in the end hurt his wife or his ex-wife by the end of it, and any relatives or friends or people he would have had a connection with. And the book is not morally responsible in valuing that enough. It's more so his selfish adventure of him retreating back to a former backsliding state of himself, very like teenagery, immature, angsty, and basically being like, "Oh, feel sorry for me. The world has to see my sacrifice," and that makes it a story where 70% of me says his actions are not justified, because he could have easily just gotten over those emotional attachments he had, taken the money, and started over. And he had so much more to live for. Even in the relationship with some slutty hippie girl that happens midway through the book is like, even that in its griminess was like better than the way he decided to go out in the end, which was to go out with a bang. And basically, so in that regard, it's not that the book isn't realistic. It's just that it's a negative story that seems like you would think it would have something deeper to say about it all, but it's really just kind of like sort of interesting to watch in the way that like B movies are interesting to watch. It doesn't have anything deep or profound to say because, and it easily could have. They could have engineered the story to where, like if Barton had his own original political ideology, but no, he was doing it because he felt like he was a reactionary force to basically everything he was unhappy about in the world. And he waited till the last minute to do anything villainous. And when he did so, he was still not trying to kill anyone. He was mostly just reacting like throwing a tantrum. Like he was like trying to scare people and make a statement to the TV news. So it was really, when you really think about the plot, that seems like somewhat of a missed opportunity, as though the book is afraid to say anything because it seems like King was self-aware of the power of the realism of his writing at the time. And so from then to now, from 1973 forward to now, it's not very politically on either side, I think, of the aisle, but a lot of people could easily misinterpret it that way. But I don't think it is if you really look at in the fine print of what the plot entails. Like Barton had opportunities to like move the plants. But he didn't, because it wouldn't have been exactly what he wanted. And so a lot of it was about his own pride, and that is what reminded me actually the most of the similarities between him and Walter White, which backs my Breaking Bad theory here. So with that in mind, yes, this is one of the most, like, for me, this has changed my view on how I look at attributing worth to a novel, because it was so effective and engaging, not moment to moment, but the story, and it had an effect on me that was powerful, but it wasn't good in the sense of being like spiritually nurturing or enlightening or motivating or no positivity. It was all just kind of things get shittier and shittier and shittier, and you keep wanting a reason, but all you get are details. And you do want to know what happens next, but it was so depressing for me that I started to like felt like things were getting predictable on the one hand, like I think I know where this is going up until the end. And then when the big crescendo plot development happens at the end, you're kind of like, okay, well, I mean, it wasn't a bad story, but it wasn't exactly. You had to ask yourself, like, why did I read this? And so I wouldn't say, as far as the bibliography of Stephen King is concerned, that this is essential reading. I would say this is for King purists who want a solid, entertaining, interesting, dark, depressing, realistic, immersive story, who have read all of Stephen King's superior books, the ones that have more heroism or have something out of this world supernatural to escape into, like the Dark Tower or something like that. And then they got bored of all those books, and then they have books like this that he wrote on the side that are good, but they're nothing compared to other masterpieces that he's written. So I give it a 7 out of 10. It was pretty good. I think it's the most depressing King book I've read so far. So I liked it for being effective in that regard. I didn't actually enjoy the story. I got no real enjoyment or satisfaction from the book, just more negativity to contrast with the similarities that I, sad to say, I see in myself in the main character in certain ways at times when your back's to a wall with the things you're unhappy with about the world in some ways. So not exactly the venting revenge fantasy that I wanted. Like I like 80s revenge like thriller fantasies where crazy psychotic shit happens and good guys turn bad, like in moderation when I'm in the mood. But this was more of one that hit a little too close to home for me, and I connected with a little bit too more than I bargained for. And so I assume as the years go by, I'll look back on it with more like gratitude and fondness because it was such an engaging experience. But as far as being immersed in the moment, I really didn't enjoy it. And so I'm hesitant to really recommend this to anyone now. Now, if you're curious, you've been informed on whatever my opinion is worth. So anyway, I give it a 7 out of 10. It's good, not great. Thanks for watching. More reviews later. The next Bachman book I'm going to read is The Running Man, and I'll tell you what I think of that. So I'm 3 down, a few more to go. Ciao.